In the year 1746, the city of New Orleans was still young, clinging to the muddy banks of the Mississippi River like a stubborn weed that refused to die. The air hung heavy with decay and salt, carrying the faint scent of molasses and the sound of insects that never seemed to rest. It was a city divided by wealth and cruelty, where fine-dressed merchants toasted to their fortunes while enslaved men and women bent their backs under the sun, their names erased from record but not from memory. Among the plantations that stretched across the outer lands was one of infamy, the Duval plantation, owned by the family of Charles Duval Sr., a man whose greed and temper had made him a feared figure in the parish. His son, Charles Duval Jr., had inherited not only his father's land, but his appetite for domination. The Duval name carried weight in those parts, and their cruelty was whispered about in taverns and churches alike, as though the soil itself could still feel the blood they had spilled upon it. The Duval plantation sprawled across more than 2,000 acres, a humid prison of sugarcane and sorrow. The main house stood in stark white against the dark marshland, its windows shuttered like blind eyes, and behind it lay the rows of shacks, where the enslaved lived in silence. Each morning began with the clang of the overseer's bell, summoning them to the fields before the first light. The cane stalks cut their skin, the sun burned their flesh, and the overseer's whip carved reminders of obedience into their backs. At the center of this dominion stood Duval Jr., a man whose presence was felt long before it was seen. He rode a black mare, his boots polished, his voice loud enough to cut through the buzzing of cicadas. To the slaves, his laughter was more frightening than his rage. It came suddenly, like thunder before the storm, and always promised pain to follow. He kept a silver flask of rum at his belt and a riding crop that had tasted more human skin than horsehide. In his mind, the plantation was not merely a business, but a stage for his power. The summer of 1746 had been the cruelest in memory. The heat did not relent, the mosquitoes carried fever, and the river swelled beyond its banks, turning fields into swamps of despair. Food was scarce, tempers were shorter, and the slaves whispered of curses beneath their breath. At night, the sound of frogs echoed across the cane rows, mingling with the faint cries from the quarters when Duval Jr. took his chosen victims. He was known to visit the women when he was drunk, his footsteps heavy, his breath sour with liquor. None dared to resist him, for those who did were made examples, whipped in front of the others until flesh gave way to bone. Among those who endured his cruelty was Mary, a young woman who had arrived from the coast of Senegambia 5 years earlier. She had been branded upon arrival, her name stripped from her tongue, and yet within her burned a quiet fire that no man could extinguish. The other slaves said little about her, but they noticed how she met Duval's eyes without flinching, even when he beat her. Beyond the fields, the swamp pressed in close, a labyrinth of cypress and stagnant water where the air itself seemed to breathe. The Duval family feared it, believing spirits lived there, the restless dead of those who had tried and failed to escape. Yet it was in those murky depths that the enslaved sometimes found refuge, gathering in secret after nightfall to whisper songs from the old world, to remember the ancestors who had not been forgotten. They spoke of rebellion in voices too soft to carry, of freedom that lived not in their hands but in their hearts. Still, the weight of the overseer's presence kept them tethered, the fear of his retribution tightening like a rope around their throats. In the main house, life continued untouched by the suffering below. The Duval family dined on roasted meat and imported wine while the enslaved gnawed at cornmeal and dried fish. Laughter echoed through the halls as though the screams outside were no more than the sounds of the night. But beneath that veneer of control, something darker was beginning to stir. Rumors spread among the quarters that Duval Jr. had grown careless, that his drinking had worsened, that his cruelty had crossed the line even his own father could not defend. He was said to have beaten a man to death for dropping a bucket, and the overseer who once took pride in his control began to lose his grip. The plantation, once ruled by order and fear, began to hum with unease. By the time autumn crept across the bayou, the wind carried whispers through the cane fields, and even the masters could feel the shift. The animals grew restless, the workers slower, the nights heavier. Something was coming, though no one could name it. The Duval plantation stood still in its misery, a place where time itself seemed to rot, and all who lived there felt the weight of something waiting, something inevitable, silent, and drawing closer with every breath. The cruelty of Charles Duval Jr. was not born overnight. It was a sickness that festered inside him since boyhood, nurtured by a father who believed compassion was weakness and violence was the language of authority. The slaves of the Duval plantation knew this well, for the overseer's moods dictated the rhythm of their lives. When he was sober, the day passed under the scorching sun with back-breaking labor and the lash of the whip as punctuation. When he was drunk, the nights were worse than death. His cruelty was theatrical, a spectacle of dominance where he sought not only to punish, but to humiliate, to break the spirit of those who served under him. He would drag men from their shacks for imagined offenses, strip them before the others, and deliver beatings so severe the ground beneath would darken with blood. He took pleasure in silence, often smiling as he worked, demanding no screams, as though the lack of sound made the suffering more pure. To the enslaved, his shadow stretched long and wide, and each footstep approaching their quarters was a prayer unanswered. In this world of cruelty, Mary existed like a ghost among the living. She moved with quiet purpose, her eyes steady, her body bearing the marks of both endurance and rebellion. Born into freedom on the coast of West Africa, she had been captured during a raid and sold through the ports of Gory Island before finding herself chained in the hold of a French ship bound for Louisiana. The memory of her home had long since faded, but the will that lived within her had not died. On the Duval plantation, she learned the art of invisibility, how to move unseen, how to listen without being noticed, how to hide her hatred behind obedience. She worked in the fields at dawn, her hands raw and swollen, and at night she served in the kitchens of the main house where the smell of roasted meat mocked the emptiness in her stomach. Yet those who watched her closely knew there was something different about her, something dangerous that could not be whipped away. Her silence was not submission, it was calculation. The overseer's cruelty toward her was particularly vile. He saw her defiance as a challenge to his authority, and that challenge became his obsession. There were nights when the slaves would hear her name shouted through the walls of the overseer's quarters, followed by the sound of breaking glass, muffled sobs, and silence. When she returned to the fields, her face would be swollen, her wrists bruised, and yet her eyes, those dark, steady eyes, never lost their flame. Duval Jr. mistook her restraint for defeat, believing he had finally crushed her, not realizing that every act of cruelty only deepened the resolve that would one day destroy him. The others pitied her, but feared her too, for to be near Mary was to invite punishment. The overseer had once whipped a boy to death for trying to shield her from a blow. From that day forward, no one spoke her name aloud. There was a particular night, remembered by those who lived long enough to tell it, when Duval's drunken cruelty reached its peak. The rain had come in sheets that evening, flooding the yard and turning the ground into a pit of mud and misery. The overseer returned from the main house in a rage, his shirt stained with wine, shouting curses at no one and everyone. He stumbled through the quarters, slamming open doors, searching for someone to unleash his anger upon. When he found Mary, he dragged her outside, forcing her to kneel in the mud while he berated her for imagined insolence. The others watched in silence, their eyes downcast, their bodies trembling. He struck her across the face with the back of his hand, splitting her lip open, and when she did not cry, he struck her again. Still, she did not make a sound. He demanded she beg, but her silence infuriated him more than any word could have. He left her there, drenched and bloodied, and staggered back to his quarters with the rage of a man defeated by his own impotence. In the days that followed, something changed in Mary. The exhaustion that had always weighed her shoulders seemed to vanish, replaced by an eerie calm. She spoke less, worked harder, and watched the overseer from a distance with the stillness of a predator. Those around her sensed the change too, though they could not name it. When Duval Jr. rode through the fields, barking orders, she no longer averted her gaze. When he struck others, she did not flinch. It was as if she had crossed some invisible threshold between fear and fury. The older slaves whispered that the spirits had touched her, that the ancestors had chosen her to deliver vengeance in a land that had forgotten mercy. Even the air around her felt different, thicker somehow, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Charles Duval Jr., in his arrogance, never saw the danger he had created. He believed himself untouchable, the master of all he surveyed. But cruelty has a way of blinding those who wield it, dulling their sense of consequence. As he drank deeper and slept heavier, his power began to erode. not from rebellion in the fields, but from the quiet patience of the woman he had tormented. She waited, and she watched, as his arrogance became carelessness. Every night he returned more intoxicated, every morning more reckless. The slaves began to murmur that the overseer's shadow had begun to shorten, that his reign was nearing its end. And in the midst of that slow unraveling stood Mary, the silent witness to his cruelty, carrying within her the calm certainty of a storm waiting to break. The night of the storm arrived without warning, creeping over the Louisiana sky like a shroud. The wind came first, bending the cane fields until they whispered like the dead, and then came the rain, relentless and cold, hammering against the shacks with a fury that made the earth tremble. The slaves huddled in their cabins, praying in silence as thunder rolled over the bayou. In the overseer's quarters, Charles Duval Jr. sat alone, a bottle of imported rum clutched in his hand, his eyes glazed from drink. He had spent the day in rage, shouting at the workers for the flooded fields, accusing them of sabotage, of laziness, of curses that he claimed followed him like flies. But now, as the rain poured through the cracks in his roof and lightning split the sky in violent flashes, he was simply another man drowning in his own decay. His boots lay discarded near the door, his whip coiled on the table, and the silver flask he prized so dearly glinted in the candlelight beside his empty glass. Mary had not been seen since dusk. Some said she had gone to fetch water before the storm broke, others said she was hiding, but none dared to look for her. The fear of Duval's temper kept them silent, and yet beneath that silence was a tension that could be felt in the very air. The storm seemed to breathe with them, each gust of wind like a warning, each clap of thunder like a heartbeat growing louder. Inside her small cabin, Mary sat by the dim glow of a dying candle, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the wall. The years of pain, the nights of humiliation, the smell of his sweat and rum, it all circled in her mind like vultures around a corpse. Something inside her had already broken, but what replaced it was not despair. It was purpose, slow, deliberate, and final. When the rain reached its peak, drowning out all other sounds, she rose from her stool and stepped into the night. The mud clung to her feet, sucking at her steps as if the earth itself were trying to hold her back. Her clothes clung to her body, soaked and heavy, but she did not shiver. She moved through the darkness with certainty, guided not by sight but by memory. The overseer's quarters were lit by a single lantern flickering near the window, casting long shadows across the flooded yard. The door was slightly ajar, swinging with the wind, and from inside came the sound of Duval's voice, a low, slurred hum of a song he barely remembered. He was drunk, lost in the haze that had become his constant refuge. Mary paused for only a moment, her breath steady, her eyes narrowed. Then she stepped across the threshold. Duval looked up when the door creaked open, his bleary gaze struggling to focus. For a brief instant, confusion flickered across his face, followed by the twisted smirk of recognition. He laughed, waving his hand lazily for her to pour him another drink. His voice was thick, his words mumbled, his arrogance still intact. He called her closer, taunting her with the same tone he had used for years, as if she were a toy brought to amuse him in his solitude. But Mary said nothing. She moved toward him with slow precision, her shadow stretching across the floor until it merged with his. The storm outside masked every sound, and when the next flash of lightning lit the room, it caught the glint of something in her hand, something sharp, cold, and purposeful. He barely had time to react. The rum bottle slipped from his grasp and shattered on the floor as pain exploded through him, sudden and absolute. The candle flickered wildly, casting grotesque shapes against the wall. His voice rose, first in confusion, then in horror. The rain drowned his cries, the thunder swallowed his pleas. Mary's face remained unreadable, her eyes reflecting nothing of what she had endured. In those few moments, years of agony condensed into a single act. The room filled with the smell of blood and alcohol, thick and metallic, coating the air like smoke. The overseer collapsed forward, his body trembling as the world around him dimmed. She did not speak, did not cry, did not tremble. The storm outside reached its height, roaring like 1,000 voices calling out from the swamp. When she finally stepped back, her hands were steady. The rain still poured, the wind still howled, And yet inside that small room, a strange silence took hold. Duval lay motionless, his breath shallow, his body twitching in the dirt and rum. The lantern sputtered out, leaving only the flashes of lightning to reveal what had been done. Mary turned away, her shadow passing over the overturned chair, the broken glass, the blood-soaked floor. She walked out into the storm, as if it were her baptism, the rain washing over her like absolution. The thunder cracked again, shaking the cane fields, and the slaves who lay awake in their cabins heard it, but none dared to move. They knew something had changed, though they did not yet know what. The air itself seemed lighter, though still filled with dread, and in the distance the sound of the storm began to fade into a strange, uneasy calm that the land had not known in years. The morning after the storm broke over the Duval plantation like judgment. The air was still thick with the smell of wet earth and decay, the cane fields bent low beneath the weight of rain, and the house stood eerily quiet, as if the land itself were waiting to exhale. When the first light crept through the clouds, one of the field hands was sent to check on the overseer, for no bell had rung, no orders had been shouted, and the usual curses that began the day were absent. The man approached the overseer's quarters with hesitation, his feet sinking into the soaked ground, his heart pounding as he reached for the door that hung loosely on its hinges. Inside, the stench hit him first, the sharp iron scent of blood mingled with the sweetness of spilled rum. The candle from the night before had long since burned out, leaving behind only a blackened pool of wax and the faint buzzing of flies that had already begun to gather. When his eyes adjusted to the dim light, what he saw made him stumble backward into the mud, his scream swallowed by the wind that swept through the doorway. Charles Duval Jr. was alive, but barely. He lay sprawled on the floor, his body twisted in agony, his face pale and drenched in sweat. The once proud overseer, the man who had ruled with a whip and laughter, was reduced to a shivering wreck. His clothes were torn, his hands clawing weakly at the air, and the blood that stained the floor was dark and thick. When help was called from the main house, the others gathered at the door, peering in with a mix of horror and disbelief. The master himself arrived soon after, his boots splattered with mud, his face tight with fury. He pushed through the crowd, his voice sharp with demand, but the moment he looked upon his son, the color drained from his face. What he saw was not punishment, but desecration. The doctor was summoned from town, though none could imagine what medicine could cure what had been done. The Duval family name, once spoken with fear, was now whispered with pity and disgust. The overseer, who had inflicted suffering upon so many, had been unmanned in every sense of the word. The slaves were ordered to stay silent, but silence could not contain what had happened. Rumors spread like wildfire, twisting through the quarters with each telling. Some said Mary had done it with a knife she'd hidden for months. Others claimed she'd used the overseer's own blade, turning his weapon against him in poetic retribution. A few swore that the spirits of the swamp had guided her hand, that no mortal woman could have struck with such precision and disappeared without trace. The overseer's screams echoed through the house for days as he lingered between life and death, his voice hoarse from pain, his pride shattered beyond repair. His father forbade anyone from speaking her name, insisting she had been taken by the storm, lost to the bayou. But in the quarters, in the dark hours before dawn, the slaves whispered her name with reverence and fear. Mary had become something more than a woman. She had become a myth, a curse, a symbol of what lay beyond endurance. Search parties were sent out across the plantation, scouring the flooded fields and the tangled swamps. Dogs were brought in to track her scent, their howls cutting through the morning mist, but each time they drew near the marshes, they grew restless and refused to go further. The bayou seemed to swallow all trace of her, as though it had opened its mouth to protect one of its own. Near Bayou Sauvage, the searchers found a torn piece of fabric clinging to a branch, a shred of cloth stained dark with what might have been blood. That was all that remained. The master declared her dead, though no body was ever recovered. The plantation was locked in fear for weeks, the slaves forced to work under the watch of armed guards. Yet even they moved with unease, glancing often toward the swamps where the trees swayed without wind. Some claimed to see her shadow at night, moving through the fog, her eyes glinting like river stones before vanishing again into the mist. Charles Duval Jr. never recovered. He lingered in bed, his body weak, his voice trembling whenever he spoke. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by terror. He refused to sleep near windows, demanded candles be kept burning at all hours, and flinched at every sound that came from outside. The slaves were forbidden from entering his quarters, and yet sometimes they heard him muttering in the dark, begging forgiveness from no one in particular. The master grew bitter, consumed with rage at the disgrace his family had suffered. He ordered harsher punishments, tighter control, but it was as if the plantation itself had turned against him. Tools went missing, animals broke free, the crops withered. The overseer's mutilation had marked the land as surely as it had marked him. By the time winter crept upon Louisiana, the story had reached the nearby parishes. Traders, priests, and even soldiers spoke in hushed voices of the slave woman who had risen against her master's cruelty and vanished into the bayou. Some saw it as divine justice, others as a sign of the devil's hand. Churches warned their congregations of the dangers of letting sin fester, while the slaves heard something else in the tale, a spark of hope buried within horror. They began to leave offerings by the edge of the swamp, bits of food, pieces of cloth, whispered prayers carried by the wind. They called her the woman of the storm, the one who had faced her tormentor and lived long enough to make him fear the night he once owned. The legend grew like the vines in the marsh, twisting through time, impossible to uproot, impossible to forget. The hunt for Mary consumed the Duval plantation like a fever. For days after the mutilation of Charles Duval Jr., men on horseback combed the cane fields, their torches slicing through the mist, their dogs straining at their leashes as the echo of barking rolled across the flooded land. The master ordered every slave questioned, beaten if necessary, but no one spoke. The slaves kept their eyes down, their lips sealed, for silence was the last weapon left to them. The marshland surrounding the plantation was treacherous and vast, a labyrinth of black water and gnarled cypress trees that could swallow a person whole. Men had drowned in those waters before, their bodies never found, and the overseer's men feared the whispers that said the swamp protected the runaway, that the spirits of the dead slaves guided her steps. Even the dogs began to refuse the scent, whining and pulling back as if sensing something unholy ahead. The search parties pressed on for days, through mud that clung to their boots and rain that blurred the horizon, until exhaustion turned to dread, and dread to silence. At night, when the riders returned empty-handed, the plantation grew tense with unease. The master paced the veranda with a pistol in hand, his face pale beneath the lantern light. He muttered about curses, about God's punishment, about betrayal within his own walls. He ordered the slaves locked in their quarters, the doors barred from outside, as if the woman he sought might rise from among them again. Inside those shacks, huddled in the dark, the enslaved whispered her name in secret. They spoke of her as though she were no longer flesh and blood, but a spirit of vengeance born from the swamp. Some claimed to see her reflection in the water, a fleeting shape that vanished when the lightning flashed. Others swore they heard her voice carried on the wind, soft and distant, like a hymn for the dead. The fear that had once bound them to their masters began to shift. For the first time, fear belonged to the white men too. One evening, a week after the storm, a group of searchers ventured deeper into the bayou, farther than anyone dared go before. The air was thick with the smell of rot and the buzz of insects, the water black and still as glass. Their torches hissed when drops of rain touched the flames, and the calls of unseen creatures echoed through the trees. They came upon a clearing where the remnants of a campfire smoldered faintly, surrounded by footprints that led nowhere. Nearby, tangled among the roots of an ancient cypress, they found a strip of linen stained dark red. Whether it was hers or not, no one could say, but the men swore that as they bent to retrieve it, the swamp itself seemed to breathe, a low, sucking sound from beneath the water, followed by ripples that spread outward as though something unseen had stirred below. They left in panic, abandoning their torches in the mud, swearing they would never return. The master refused to accept defeat. He sent word to neighboring plantations, offering a reward for Mary's capture, dead or alive. The stories spread across parishes, carried by travelers and traders until her name became a warning whispered among the fields. Yet despite the promises of gold, no bounty hunter dared take the task. The legend had already begun to grow, twisting into something the master could not control. Each retelling made her more powerful, more elusive. Some said she had drowned in the swamp, her body taken by the current. only for her spirit to rise again in the storms that followed. Others believed she lived among the Maroons, escaped slaves hidden deep in the wetlands, their settlements guarded by the wild and the dark. The Duval men searched still, but their footsteps grew slower, their voices quieter, as though afraid of being heard by the very thing they hunted. The plantation itself began to wither under the weight of its fear. The crops rotted in the fields, the soil turning sour, the livestock falling sick without reason. At night, the workers heard the rustle of movement beyond the cane, though no one dared investigate. The master's wife took ill, her sleep haunted by dreams of a woman standing at the edge of the swamp, her face half hidden by shadow, her hands red as the dawn. Charles Duval Jr., confined to his bed, screamed her name in delirium, crying that she stood in the corner watching him. The doctor called it fever, but the slaves said otherwise. They said Mary had not left at all, that she had become part of the land, her vengeance seeping into the soil and water. Even the dog stopped barking after dark, curling up with low growls when the wind passed through the fields. By late November, the search was abandoned. The marsh had reclaimed its secrets. The river had washed away the tracks, and the name of Mary Duval, or what they called her, became taboo. The master forbade it spoken aloud, punishing anyone caught whispering of her. But fear does not obey rules. It grows in silence, and in that silence, her story spread beyond the plantation. Travelers along the Mississippi spoke of seeing her figure walking the levee at night, her wet dress clinging to her form, her eyes glinting like fireflies in the dark. The swamp people told of a woman's song drifting through the trees, mournful and low, that lured cruel men from their camps, never to return. The Duval family's legacy began to unravel, their power rotting from the inside, while the legend of the runaway woman who had struck down her tormentor grew roots that no man could cut away. As the years passed, the Duval plantation became a place of whispers and avoidance. The fields that once produced sugar for the markets of New Orleans now stood overgrown with weeds, the soil heavy with neglect. The overseer's quarters remained locked, its wooden boards rotting, its windows sealed, yet those who dared walk near it swore they could still hear sounds from within. Soft creaks, a faint dragging noise, or the muffled echo of a man's groan swallowed by the walls. The slaves who remained worked in silence, their faces marked by exhaustion, their eyes hollow. And yet beneath that emptiness lived something else, a quiet reverence for the woman who had defied her tormentor. Her story had long since left the plantation and spread through the parishes, carried by fugitives and traders, reshaped by every tongue that told it. To the masters it was a cautionary tale, a reminder of what unchecked cruelty could breed. To the enslaved, it was a sacred story of retribution, proof that even the most powerless could summon a force greater than fear itself. By 1750, the legend of the Woman of the Storm had become inseparable from the land. Travelers spoke of eerie lights flickering across the swamps near Bayou Sauvage, dancing like lanterns before vanishing into mist. Hunters returned from the marsh claiming to have heard a woman's laughter carried over the water, low and mocking, just before the wind rose and the trees bent toward the ground. Some swore that during the fiercest rains, when lightning struck the cypress and the earth trembled, a shadow would appear along the riverbank. A tall figure, motionless, her eyes reflecting the storm's light. The priests in New Orleans dismissed it as superstition, a tale invented by frightened workers, but even they hesitated to travel near the Duval property after dark. The master's remaining sons abandoned the estate, leaving it to decay in the damp heat, its once grand house sinking slowly into the earth. What had been a symbol of power now stood as a tomb, haunted not by ghosts, but by memory. Those who tilled nearby lands said the air around the old plantation felt different, heavier somehow, as if the ground itself remembered what had been spilled upon it. Birds avoided the fields, and the sound of frogs, once deafening, had grown strangely absent. The swamp seemed alive in a way that defied understanding, breathing with the rhythm of something ancient. Among the enslaved people of neighboring plantations, the story of Mary became more than history. It became ritual. Mothers told their daughters her name in whispers before sleep, not as a tale of horror, but as a prayer for strength. Her act was retold around dying fires, her courage folded into songs that carried the weight of generations. They spoke of how she had risen against the overseer not from madness, but from justice, not from hate, but from the refusal to remain silent any longer. Her defiance became legend, her name invoked in secret whenever the lash cracked or the chains grew too heavy. The Duval family's fortune collapsed in the years that followed. Traders refused their sugar, workers fled under cover of night, and the nearby settlers claimed the family had been cursed. Charles Duval Sr. died alone, found slumped over his desk, his face frozen in terror, though no one could say what he had seen before his final breath. His son, the mutilated overseer, lingered for several years more, bedridden and half-mad. He was tended by a series of nurses, none of whom stayed long. They told stories of waking in the night to the sound of a woman's voice whispering in the corners of the room, of candles blowing out by unseen hands, of footsteps pacing outside the door though no one was there. One night, during a summer storm, the overseer's screams echoed through the house, so loud they startled the servants from their sleep. By morning, he was dead, his face contorted as though caught between terror and disbelief. The locals buried him near the edge of the property, and even the priest who came to bless the grave refused to linger after the final words. After his death, no one dared live on the Duval land. The house was left to ruin, reclaimed by vines and moss, the roof collapsing in places where the rain never stopped. Travelers who passed along the river at night said they could see a faint glow from the upper windows, a flickering light like a candle held by invisible hands. The bayou grew thicker around it, swallowing the fences, the fields, and finally, the road that once led to the house. By the 1760s, only the foundation remained visible above the reeds, and the rest had vanished beneath the slow, suffocating crawl of the swamp. Yet the legend of the woman of the storm did not fade. Each generation added to it, reshaping her image, a ghost to some, a goddess to others, a symbol of wrath to all. It was said that men who mistreated their slaves near the river often met strange fates, found drowned in shallow water, their faces twisted in fear, their bodies untouched by teeth or claw. The locals said she chose her nights carefully, that when the wind began to shift and the frogs went silent, the woman of the storm walked again through the marsh, her footsteps echoing in the dark like the sound of chains being broken,